Hello, everyone. Welcome to a rather chilly episode of the War Report. Now, I'll have you all know I'm safe and secure in an undisclosed location in the tropics. You, unfortunately, I believe, are stuck in the heart of this brutal winter. But I know how you Slavs are. You people are built for this kind of disgusting weather. So, but in all seriousness, I hope everyone's staying warm. I hope any of our audience that may just so happen to be in Texas is doing okay if you even have the power to listen to this. In which case, I thank you for devoting your very limited resources to this program. It means a lot to me. But to get into the news in an area that is anywhere but cold, let's start with Syria and go into some Middle Eastern news because, oh boy, it's a very Middle Eastern heavy show, which we haven't had in quite some time. So, out of Syria, of course, the Russian campaigns began bombing again and again, and it looks like they're finally closing in on this small pocket in Idlib in northwestern Syria, which it's been a long time coming, but especially in the recent weeks. I think last show we said there was something upwards of 700 Russian strikes on targets within Idlib. Of course, there's been ISIS resurgence in the Turkish-backed forces part controlled of that pocket in northwestern Syria in the light green on the map. The Kurds have been more emboldened lately since Biden came to office, which I don't think anyone was not expecting. There's been ISIS resurgences, and of course, in central Syria, along the Euphrates, along the border of the government controlled and Kurdish controlled territories. And above all, one of the stranger developments is Israel agreeing to some sort of prisoner exchange with Russia. Well, Russia negotiating on behalf of Syria and pro Syrian forces. That also involves the selling of the Sputnik vaccine. It's very convoluted. I didn't quite understand exactly what it was, but point being is apparently Israel is giving 1.2 million to Russia to negotiate this prisoner exchange that also involves Russia selling them the COVID vaccine, which make what sense of that you will. And of course, Israel's been hammering Iranian targets in eastern Syria, so pretty standard fare for Syria this week. American presence has been relatively quiet there, which I think a lot of people are surprised. They're expecting Biden to have a more robust foreign policy out of the gate, but I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but it looks like thus far, with today being exactly a month of him being in office, it looks like that hasn't quite happened yet. Now, time will tell where that goes, but it looks like with everything going on in the U.S., especially with this freak weather, which has caused havoc all across the country, a lot of focus is not on external issues, whether that be Syria, whether that be Iraq, whether that be China, Russia, etc. But Syria, again, things are just slowly inching towards what I'd say we've been talking about for the past 2.5, almost 3 years now. This program is almost 3 years old. How about that?
Yeah. I mean, the only blip I've seen that's been significant regarding U.S. presence in Syria has been a new base which they are constructing where northern Syria, Turkey, and Iraq meet. This is right on the border inside Syria. I'm thinking that a lot of this probably has to do with the regular incursions that Turkey is making into Iraq to fight the Kurds there. There was an explosion this week, which injured a U.S. Serviceman. It killed a U.S. Private contractor, and about five or six others were wounded. So now I don't know who's taken claim and who can be believed, but uh, I would think that there could be several forces at work that would be responsible for that. But my guess is this is just the U.S. keeping tabs on what Turkey is doing. Not that America has huge problems with what Turkey is doing.
For the
That
time
isn't to
being, it's
say
a
for
relatively
the time
unstable
being.
partner. Just keep that in mind.
Right. Like if Russia was to be removed out of Syria as well as Iran, then Turkey would probably be forced to retract as well. But for the moment, it serves American interests there.
And that's sort of the story with Turkey, and they've been relatively quiet recently after these past few months of them pretty much dominating the headlines not only on this show but even within the media outside of the stuff with the election and like the COVID stuff. But it looks like between the Caucasus, Libya, and Syria, Turkey's been pretty quiet lately. Now, I don't think that's going to last soon, that much longer. I think soon we're probably going to see something out of Turkey, but time will tell. As we were saying about the events in Iraq, there were attacks on U.S. forces again. I believe there were also attacks on the U.S. Embassy. This has become a routine thing that sort of got swept under the rug between all the other bigger news stories, well, relatively bigger news stories. And again, I haven't seen any group take responsibility for it, whether that be an Iranian backed group, whether that be ISIS or whatever. But speaking of Iran, Biden is eager to begin negotiations with Iran to try to either replace or salvage the Iran deal. And this is on top of Hezbollah's recent threats to Israel. I believe they said they have enough missiles to wipe every major Israeli city off the map. It was some extraordinary claim like that. Now, how much that you believe, again, it's up for debate. Israel's also been running air defense drills, and they've been practicing on how to hit up to 700 targets a week, I believe they said. So, uh, it, I think it was between 700 and 1,000 targets a week that the Israeli air forces are practicing to hit, whether that be in Gaza, whether that be in Lebanon, whether that be in Syria. So, the Israeli leadership, especially now that they've finally gotten their phone call from Biden, I know it's horrible. He didn't contact them within the first 2 weeks, like every president in the past 40 years has done. He's so horrible for Israel. It's going to be a terrible time. They're pretty frustrated with the American showing in the Middle East and when it comes to Israel. Not only that, but they're also showing signs of nervousness. Now, people speculate, and by people I mean what I saw on Southfront and from a few other sources, that what's expected to happen this year and in the coming years, the Biden administration is expected to increase military aid in terms of money, in terms of weapons sold to Israel, but take a more backseat role in involvement in the Middle East, similar to what the Obama administration did, where they gave Israel a lot of aid. They would finger wag at them over the Palestinian issue, but they gave them a lot of aid and a lot of leeway to do whatever they want in Syria and Lebanon with their neighbors. And when it comes to the Iran issue, but it's looking like Biden again has returned to that sort of status quo, and he's pretty eager. I wouldn't say desperate quite yet to salvage some sort of deal with Iran, to salvage some sort of agreement with Iran, and really return to, I would say, like 2014, 2015 status quo with militant groups running amok in Iraq and Syria, keeping that region stabilized, more or less coming to a agreement with Iran, keeping Israel at bay, keeping them just happy enough, as well as I haven't seen any real moves or even statements about the Biden administration policy towards Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but I imagine it would be, again, sort of that hands off support of the Saudi war effort. But it looks like the pieces are really falling into place for the Biden foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, by no means is it like a non interventionist foreign policy. By no means did Biden get us out of the Middle East. But it's a much less overtly aggressive foreign policy than Trump, which is what I was expecting, which is, I also believe you said you were expecting. Sort of, again, a return to that status quo where we're there, we're ultimately pulling the strings. I mean, us and certain influences that we're not allowed to talk about. But it's not this sort of belligerent attitude that the Trump administration took when they would sail the entire Fifth Fleet into the Persian Gulf and uh, fire missiles at Iranian backed forces or give intelligence to Israel to do such. But really, not much has changed beyond the rhetoric.
Yeah, for now, it hasn't. I mean, there was even a story that surfaced this week of a U.S. patrol being shunned by locals and forced to turn around, something that we saw a lot more of last year. But I would argue that it's still too early to say, and I think that the Biden administration, on some level, is more invested or feels it can work with American general staff, for finding a way to topple Assad and to remove Russian presence there. I mean, I think it's safe to say they are as committed in Syria as they are in Afghanistan and Iraq. Um, I think that's obvious now. Also, it should be pointed out that I think near the beginning of COVID, after the first lockdowns, when we saw an undeniable uptick in ISIS presence and resurgence in Deir ez-Zor and other areas around there, um, that something was heating up, something wasn't making sense. And then, really, about you know, literally 3.5 weeks later, the BLM riots began. Um, I take that to mean that this is also part of the sophisticated rigging that it was a sign that Trump had lost power. Um, with the military. That isn't to say that Biden completely controls the military either, or there might be the same kind of, let's say, paradoxical uh, messaging that they're doing. One example is we were talking, I think, last week or the week before about the phone call between Xi Jinping and Biden and how they had, relatively different ideas about what had happened. Uh, we saw in the town hall Biden stressing that, we'll continue to message to Beijing what we're not happy about because we're a nation of values, not an ethnicity. However, we understand that China is different. And yet, when you follow the news, you don't get a sense that that's really the case. You get a sense that America is shoring up its military and asking allies to help them out in the South China Sea. So we may see this kind of messaging going on well after Trump. That's a definite possibility. Uh, so it could be the calm before the storm, and there could be a storm coming in Syria. Probably the next big target will be the city of Al Bab, which uh, ISIS took over. ISIS was removed from there about 2.5 years ago, and so Turkish and Turkish aligned forces have taken a hold of the city. But there are big problems there: protests, people getting shot at protests. It's not stable, and the Syrian Arab Army seems to be prepared to take the city back. That could be a spark. That could be where the fuse is lit, so to speak, because Russia has really stepped up its bombing campaign, both in Idlib in the Deir ez-Zor desert area. Um, Turkey has been forced to recomply with patrols. And Al Bab, speaking of patrols and patrols on the M4 and the M5, Al Bab is situated in the north on M4. So it's a vital city for them. It'll be particularly important for Damascus. So we'll see if that sparks anything off.
Once again, it is a matter of a race against time because what we have right now is an administration, I would say, which is very committed to intervention in Syria, but there's no reason, there's no excuse to go in, nor is there even an opening if there was. So they have to really just play the waiting game until they actually see this opening. As you're saying, it could be this northern Syria. As things come to a close, I imagine we will see more and more incidents. I wouldn't be surprised if they revive the old chemical routine after giving it a few years break because last time they tried that was in 2019 and nobody believed it. They didn't even bother trying in 2020. 2018 was the last time it really got taken seriously, and you could chalk that up to Trump's reluctance or his hands being tied to acting in the regions. Out maybe now that they have Biden and Kamala in there, they'll be more willing to try something like this again. Time will tell, but I do agree with you. We haven't seen the light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to Syria, and we're pretty much still in the thick of it, even a decade into the war. Next month will be the 10-year anniversary of what really sparked off the war, the Arab Spring protests, and then July of this year will be the actual 10th anniversary of the actual fighting of the war when it actually really became a civil war and went beyond protests and riots. So we'll see how things look by July of this year. And like I said, I think barring an outright joint American Israeli action, I don't know, and maybe include other European powers, the UK, France, etc., barring, in my point, drastic action, the situation in Syria is more or less concluded in favor of Assad and Russia.
Hmm.
And we'll really see how that turns out. But moving on to that, we have news over Yemen. Now, it looks like the Houthis have really just broken out again. We haven't heard much from Yemen, mainly because of what the headlines do, mainly because it's got pushed to the back burner. But it looks like yet again they have the Saudi-backed forces more or less on the brink of collapse. And they've also been giving the Saudi force a hell of a time for the past 2.5 years now. And the big concern again is, well, they're in positions to strike southern Saudi Arabia, which they've been doing for about 2 years now. There's been rocket attacks on Saudi oil fields coming from allegedly Iran and the Houthis for, I would say, what was that, May 2019, during the same time of the oil tanker crisis with Iran seizing the oil tankers. So we're seeing this all come to fruition right now, and really anti the anti-Iran axis, which is made up mainly of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Gulf states backed by the U.S., sort of Trump strategy in the Middle East, where they delegate things to the other powers in order to more robustly confront Iran, which has had varying degrees of success, if you couldn't tell, but that's aside the point. It looks like, and again, to quote Southfront, the Saudis are the weakest link in this alliance, and it looks like yet again that is coming to fruition. I'm really curious to see what the Biden administration's reaction is to this, because one common theme on both domestic policy and not so much foreign policy yet, but I imagine we're getting to that point, is that Biden has betrayed the left wing base that put him into power. And one of those things that left wing base, to their credit, is very opposed to is the intervention in Yemen in particular. Even like the squad, like the AOC types in Congress, are pretty fervently anti intervention in Yemen. Again, to their credit. I think that's mainly the pet issue they can pick up on. That's the safe anti war issue they can take. But I'm curious to see if that will be yet another quote unquote betrayal of the base by Biden by really supporting the Saudi effort in Yemen, if not directly increasing U.S. involvement.
Oh, absolutely. They will be betrayed. They'll have to be because the the idea of two separate Yemens, which would not be the first time, happening again, I think is out of the question. This would give Iran too much reach. Israel would be emphatically upset. And we've seen the development over the last 4 years, particularly ramped up in the last two, of strong cooperation between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, opposing uh, basically, Iranian interests in that area. Um, there's an interesting story that has come out of the French Jewish channel in Europe, which has claimed that there is, it's called J Forum. Um, so since 2018 on Skotara Island, this is in around the Horn of Africa. This is where the Red Sea dumps off into the Indian Ocean. Well, this is a Yemeni island which was occupied by anti-Houthi forces in 2018 with the help of United Arab Emirates and now Israel. And what they want to do is set that up as a permanent spy base in order to monitor Yemen, Houthi Yemen to be exact. So I mean, everybody knows this is a very strategic route. I mean, even the Romans had a temporary outpost in that area is difficult to navigate because that area has a lot of, let's say, shallows that are particularly dangerous to ships and boats. But it also is blessed with several islands, and this is one of them. So, Skotor Socotra. I hope I'm pronouncing this the right way.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and show that on the map. I have the key a little bit in the way, but it's that little island down in the corner of the map I have right there. So
Yeah,
that's the one we're talking about.
yeah.
But yeah, really, I don't know what the range of the Iranian missiles are to the point where I know they can definitely hit targets pretty much all across Saudi Arabia if they had a stable foothold in Yemen, which I wouldn't say they've gotten to that point yet, but they're getting there. But I wouldn't put out the possibility, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert in missiles or that kind of technology or anything, but they could probably hit targets in the Negev Desert if they had that foothold in Yemen as well, which would be a
Hmm.
major cause of Israeli concern, especially considering the fact most of Israel's defenses, especially anti-air defenses, are focused in northern Syria near northern Israel near Lebanon and Syria. So that would open up yet another front that they haven't had to deal with, I would say, since they made peace with Egypt back in '79. So I I see no possibility, barring a complete like system failure on the American part, where they allow Israel to be threatened by two fronts again, even with the poor relationship between Biden and Netanyahu personally, or whatever current disputes may be going on between the U.S. and Israel. I don't see a scenario where they allow a situation like that to happen, and I also don't see a scenario, especially with Biden's wonderful energy policies. Let me just tell you about that, where they allow Saudi oil to be threatened like that.
Hmm. And I mean, it's amazing how quickly things are changing. So there was a pact that was signed between Iran, China, and Russia uh, sometime last year. And one of the results of that is training exercises that are going to be happening in the Persian Gulf between these three countries. Actually, it was, I think, December 2019, where the three held joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean. So this probably goes back a little way, but it's been cemented. They're due for another exercise. You can see probably China's predicament because it wants to keep both Tehran and Riyadh happy and not at war necessarily. Um, not having to, but the pact itself is important. Um, it is, you could argue, bad news for the West. Um, I think basically China is saying we foresee things getting worse, not better. Because I think if it had been the case otherwise, China would not have signed on to the strategic pact.
Well, to
Uh,
bolster that point in terms of desperation, not necessarily on China's side, but Saudi Arabia's, is I've been discussing for quite some time, we've been discussing for quite some time, that Saudi Arabia, again, as has been put, is the weakest link within this coalition. And
yeah.
I think it was sometime in late 2019 where they announced they were finally willing to trade oil in the yuan. Now, it was speculated as far back as when Mohammed bin Salman really came on the scene, became the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, because I believe his father or grandfather or uncle or whoever it is, whoever he's supposed to succeed, is still alive but in ailing health and pretty much holds no real power at this point, and it's all him.
Mhm.
What that was is when he made all those arrests, when he started cleaning house, there were so-called conspiracy theories, speculations, and even some things from WikiLeaks to back this up, that the CIA has more or less a plan on a massive regime change in Saudi Arabia if it were to ever hit that point, if Saudi Arabia were to ever, I say, quote unquote, betray them. Now, I believe 100% that they have that contingency plan with such a vital asset in the region. I wouldn't put it past them. Pretty much, I believe the only country we wouldn't have that on is Israel for obvious reasons, but
Yeah.
that's aside the point. I think it's a little bit of the other way around in that scenario, but enough of that, if you will. But so what I'm getting at is Biden's return to normal, as I love to harp on about. Number one, he axes American domestic energy. He makes more reliant on Middle Eastern energy, while the Middle East is in such a volatile state, and where Saudi Arabia is now doing the thing that Turkey does, that Hungary does, where they're playing both sides or multiple sides of this geopolitical struggle. You could see this with the oil war they had with Russia last April, and of course their deals with China. I don't know what Saudi Russia deals look like. I think they're still pretty much on a rival footing last time I checked, which isn't a surprise with two major oil producers like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if one of the defining moments in the Biden administration, or maybe even the Harris administration, depending on how far it goes down the road, is some sort of coup attempt or regime change in Saudi Arabia. There already was that very poorly executed coup attempt in, I believe it was 2018, where they swarmed the Saudi palace with the
Yeah.
Predator drones. So it isn't unheard of. Now that could have been a dry run. That could have been some sort of security thing. You can speculate about that all day, but that was like in 2018, 2019. But it shows that again, not only is the Saudi position in its own backyard in Yemen very weak, its own internal security state is very weak, and that is by design of the United States and by the House of Saud, because the House of Saud does not want a powerful military or security apparatus that could overthrow them. Makes sense, and I think it's a testament to the amount of confidence the House of Saud has in its own leadership, to the point where you had. Now, I'm not saying Saddam was the pinnacle of military and security strategy, but Saddam didn't even go that length. A lot of other Middle Eastern tin pot dictators didn't even go that length. But the House of Saud, since the end of World War II, has had a disgustingly weak security state. I think out of their population of what's their population? 40 something million. I could be wrong
Mhm.
about that, but they only size an army of about less than 200,000. I know it's smaller than most Western European armies like the UK, like France, like even the countries we've completely disarmed and sort of put into irrelevance in Western Europe. You may think smaller ones like Denmark, the Scandinavian states, the Netherlands, etc. I mean, and of course, Eastern Europe, with its perpetual fear of Russia, has larger militaries. But point being is, for its size and for the amount of money it makes as a country through the oil industry, it has a pretty small and poorly trained and poorly equipped military. Maybe not necessarily poorly equipped, but again, they're using weapons that are like 10 to 15 years out of date because their entire military arsenal comes from outdated U.S. military technology. But the point I'm getting at is Saudi Arabia for years now has been a basket case. Their economy still hasn't recovered from the 2014 oil boom in the United States. They've been running a budget deficit since. A country where 80% of the people work for the government, and some ridiculous amount, I think like 60 something percent of the population is just on straight welfare. Again, that's the way the Saudi state operates. They keep the population pacified through large welfare payments, and again, they pretty much disarm their own military and security forces to keep themselves in power. It's
Mhm.
quite literally, I know this gets said about a lot of countries, and a lot of times it's just complete crap the way they put it, but Saudi Arabia is just a personal playground of the House of Saud, and really, the fact that it hasn't collapsed in on itself already, I would have expected this like a year ago. Perhaps that's too optimistic of a take. But the fact that the House of Saud is still in a relative position of power, even with all the weaknesses, is stunning to me.
Yeah, well, you sum it up very well. And there, as we've said in prior shows in 2020, their economy is, as you said, very subsidized. They're in a difficult position right now. And yeah, you better believe there's a contingency plan to keep them afloat from the U.S. side. And I would imagine there's many, many players, Britain being one of them as well, France, that will want them to stay afloat.
Yeah, I really don't. I mean, and that also begs the question where if intensity increases so much in the region, will we move troops to Saudi Arabia, which is again a very risky move, as you saw. That's one of the reasons Bin Laden cited for his activities against the United States, for his jihad against the United States, was the fact that quote unquote infidel troops were on Muslim Holy Land. Now, will it get to that point again? Will we have to see American troops be in Saudi Arabia again in a Gulf War style situation? Who knows? I doubt we'd go that far. I think we have other plans in place, and not to mention, I think we need those Sunni jihadists on our side for obvious reasons, but really, it's I know no other way to put it than a massive cliche. It is a powder keg, and Yemen, I would predict that this is going to be the next hotspot. I think Syria is still going to be important. I think a lot of things are still going to happen in Syria. We have not seen the end of it by far, but the focus will be on Yemen again. And it's going to be the two-faced approach from Biden, where he's very conciliatory with the Iranian leadership. And I believe Iranian elections are either this year or next year, so we'll see how that turns out, whether a more hardline party comes to power or whether Rouhani and his gang stays in power. Because, again, they're generally more conciliatory, but I imagine he'll have to take more of a hardline stance if he wants to stay in power, both to appease the supreme leader and to appease the Iranian populace. But again, we're going to see a return to the Obama era, except the main focus, in my opinion, is going to be on Yemen rather than Syria, where it's very tough on Yemen. We have to take out the Houthis, we have to take out these Iranian-backed groups, while trying to reach a nuclear agreement with Iran. Now, again, as I've said, I don't see a path where Iran doesn't become a nuclear power at this point, barring, again, a massive multi-country intervention led by the United States, which is probably not in the cards, and even then, we're probably too late with that. I don't see either Biden or Kamala going that far with it, and I really, again, I think the focus will have to be on Yemen for the time being because I really see it as sort of their last ditch effort to keep Iran from really encircling the region because they've all but won in Syria. They have Iraq under a pretty tight grasp. The only thing they need is that foothold on the Arabian Peninsula, and it's more or less checkmate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's seriously. I mean, you have to look at the totality. The EU just signed their biggest ever trade deal in history with China. Despite all the efforts from the US, Nord Stream 2 is going to be completed. Now, they will, of course, uh, sanction the hell out of Russia, but they will resist doing it to Germany. That will,
Oh
of
yes, we'll
course,
we'll get into that. Trust
yeah,
me.
yeah. So if you look at that and you look at the pact, the security pact signed between Iran, Russia, and China, if you look at the growing influence China has in Africa, which I know people can argue and say that it's not that significant. I don't claim it's the most significant, but it does irk America to some degree. There's a trend that's been developing, and it's been developing before Trump, and it only accelerated during and after Trump. So even a place that might seem obscure, like the Houthis in Yemen, um, is a serious threat because it's a choke point. It's a trading choke point, right? It's just as important as some of the eastern islands that are under Indian control in the Indian Ocean. West of Indonesia in that area, west of
The string of pearls, if you will.
yes, the string of pearls. So they are actually very important.
But with that being said, I know no other way to put it than the Middle East is really it's an odd situation where it is a powder keg. It takes one spark to light it all off, but nobody has the initiative or brazenness to light that spark. We've seen this
Hmm.
situation localized in Syria, we've discussed at length, but region wide, nobody wants to fire that first shot, and for very understandable reasons. Even the most hawkish of people, like even John Bolton towards the end there, was still pretty cautious about a direct intervention against Iran, and with Biden and his club in power, I again, no way are they more brazen than John Bolton about the situation, who was, like, as I said, already having his doubts. So we'll see how all that plays out, but really, it takes just that one spark, and we've seen many close calls, especially under the last 2 years of Trump, where that did almost fly off the handle. Now, again, I think time will tell, but really, it's, I know I've been saying this for a while now, it's that now or never point, especially now, especially with Yemen on the brink of so-called collapse, where the time to stem Iranian influence for the people in Tel Aviv, for the people in Washington, is now, and especially in Israel, especially with Netanyahu. I don't know, this might be the thing that keeps him in power. He could do the strongman act for saying, well, look, and I'm the only one you can trust. I'm the only administration you can trust to keep Iranian influence at bay, despite the fact that his administration has oversaw the exponential growth of Iranian influence in the region. Now, I'm not saying it's his fault entirely, of course not, but the fact that he presided over it and he campaigned constantly on it. How many times did he campaign on curbing Iranian aggression? Yet, more and more under the Netanyahu's legacy, my point being, will be that of having Israel encircled by Iran, and I cannot think of a greater irony.
Yeah, I mean that is hilarious, isn't it? Certainly, the confidence that America and Israel had 20 years ago, 18 years ago, is not there. Because we've seen what has happened. Um, the fallout includes everything from the rise of populist parties in Europe because of the massive refugee and migrant um, waves that have swarmed their way into Europe.
Yeah, on top of all
Uh,
the other things that
yeah,
just decrease the confidence in liberalism, I would say that's the main thing. That's the most obvious thing. But
right. And of course,
The American-led world order, being that of liberalism, has done a number on not only the American people but people all across, I would say, the Western world. The sort of main progenitors of the people living under the regimes, not necessarily just the aligned regimes, like you'd say Saudi Arabia, which by all means is not a liberal country but a liberal aligned country. But
yeah,
again, it's the people in Eastern Europe, it's Poland, Hungary, that felt the brunt of a lot of this migration because they come up through the Balkans and go into Western Europe. They don't stay there, which is, I don't think these Eastern European economies could sustain that, but they trudge their way through. They do quite a bit of damage going through. And then you even see the rise of populism in places like France and Germany, which have bore the brunt of this migrant wave and having to accommodate them. And a lot of these people aren't even actual refugees from Syria or Iraq. They come from places like Algeria and Morocco and Egypt
right.
and even sub-Saharan Africa, places that, look, they're not, I'm sure they're not nice places to live, but it's like not war-torn conditions and it's not vital for your survival that you escape them. And again, that is the fallout from all of that. And of course, these populist movements, whether that be on either side of the Atlantic, are less prone to intervention. Sure, they may be pro-Zionist, they may be pro-Israel, but that doesn't necessarily mean they want to spearhead Israel's security matters and go in and fight for them as a neoconservative or a neoliberal might. But I think you get the point.
Yeah, there's a sense of catastrophic failure. Nobody 15 years ago, 10 years ago was talking about an American decline. Nobody is talking about a civilizational decline, right? That's a regular item of conversation now. Particularly in intellectual circles, you can frequently find these discussions taking place on even mainstream media sources. Of course, they'll have an academic talk about it, but it's not unusual, for instance, for some of them to say something along the lines of, we will see the rise of a great Eastern power, something we haven't seen in the last 500 years. Now, words to that effect have been used several times in the last year and will continue to do so, right? Um, that rings true. And you can see where this overall trajectory is going.
And I know you keep up with it more than I do, but I know the Canadian Intelligence Services, what is it, CSIS or whatever, have
Yeah.
those regular live streams. Have they been discussing that lately?
On CBC,
On the yeah, like the interview with like the CSIS spokespeople.
I personally haven't watched one since. I've Atlantic Council, the Council for what is it? It's also spelled CSIS, but it doesn't. It's not the Canadian Secret Service, anything like that. It's the Institute for International Studies and
Yeah.
so on. Yeah, so you will, yeah, if you go through their video lists, you will hear that topic brought up, but there are other radio programs where you can and uh, newspaper articles where you're going to hear that kind of more frank talk about this overall trend that's developing. I'm just saying that 3-4 years ago there were a lot of people who would say it under their breath, or it would be like an interesting conversation over a coffee. Um, at a cafe or a restaurant or what have you. But I, I'm saying it's bubbling up, and you're seeing it more in mainstream media than you would have even a year or two ago.
Yeah, and a lot of them will, ironically enough, assign a lot of blame to Trump, which they are right, but for the wrong reasons. Where I mean, again, we've discussed this at length. The man who exposed the flaws of the system rather than actually doing anything substantial, but it is, as you're saying, becoming a conversation piece. It's people are talking about America as it's no longer the country it was in the 1940s, no longer the country it was in the 60s, 70s, whatever, 80s, or even pre 9/11. It's no longer the country it was in 2001, and that's just 20 years ago. And somebody pointed out to me the other day, and I thought that was pretty interesting, more or less a tangent, but 2001 was 20 years ago. Now compare the sort of gap between the 60s and the 80s, how much cultural change there was, or the 80s and the 2000s, or the 70s and the 90s. When you go from the 2000s to the 2020s, or 90s to 2010s, it looks like beyond technology, a lot of things have just stagnated. Now, of course, there's been the rise of a lot of the stuff we talk about nowadays, the hyperliberalisms, like the critical race theory, the gender studies sort of stuff, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it looks like beyond that kind of stuff and technology, very little has really moved forward, and it feels like we've sort of just been spinning our wheels in the mud, at least in the Western world, at least in this part of the Western world. I would say places like China have undergone rapid change. Some places in Europe have undergone rapid change, Russia, the Middle East, of course, but it looks like in Western Europe and the Anglosphere, more or less, it's just spinning our wheels in the mud.
Well, in many ways, you could um, bring to highlight Texas this week, uh, and the fallout that being, unprepared has caused there. Now, I don't want to make too much of it because we had an ice storm in Canada in 1998, which was terrible. People did die during that, and it happened in an area that like is cold winters are a norm. They're indeed a routine, so I don't want to put too much emphasis on it. Be, because I mean, well, it didn't, it wasn't a portent of the destruction of Canada and Canada's ultimate decline. So I don't want to be overly dramatic about it, but um, America, I think, is slightly different because there's a sense that people have, like, let's say you talk about San Francisco, and let's say you talk about the rapid jump in violent crime post BLM from Minnesota to St. Louis to San Francisco to New York, Chicago, Atlanta. There isn't one city that hasn't reported this increase. So I think it's more ominous in the American context.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. And again, this
and
isn't like
and
the.
art, you could even say you can even say art. I mean, there hasn't really been a string of like interesting movies coming out of American cinema in a very very long time. Uh, these are fluff pieces. Anything from like Transformers or Cape Shit or whatever. Like you don't get the sense that the country takes its own culture seriously, or that it even has one anymore. Like the culture has become very political, but it hasn't produced really strong cultural artifacts.
Yeah, I.
Like there's no one directing something like Taxi Driver or Apocalypse Now or The Godfather or any of the other great films that followed thereafter.
Yeah, that's just down to cinema. Let's not even talk about the other forms of art and their
Yeah,
frank decline. I mean, look, there's a reason, and I know this is probably going to divide my audience, and this is a topic I have never discussed for obvious reasons. There's a reason why things like anime and Japanese media are increasing in popularity, because in the West, in the Anglosphere in particular, entertainment media culture has hit a dead end. We are at the end of the road. There is no point going forward. There is nothing beyond it. I don't say that from a pessimistic or black pill sort of standpoint, but I'm just saying within our current cultural narratives, within our current civilizational narratives, there is literally no point forward we can go when it comes to many things, but especially culture.
yeah. It isn't there. These aren't even adult films. They're not even for films for adults. I mean, um, like I say, that's one of the hallmarks of a civilization, that it produces cultural artifacts that both typify the civilization and create a curiosity and an interest from abroad. Now, I understand how Hollywood studios want to create a film that has that appeals to both, I don't know, audiences in China and audiences in the West, but ultimately the compromise for money is that you create artifacts that have no cultural value. Like, there's no cultural value in cape shit films. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
it's if I had to make a comparison, it's cheap consumer goods. It's junk food.
yeah,
And, really, I think that sort of encapsulates just the state of the West in general. So moving on to that, we'll talk a little bit about the recent news coming out of France. Now, Macron has, if you believe some sensationalized headlines, followed in the footsteps of Macron and banned this degenerate ideology within French universities. But really, he just said he's going to crack down on that. Now, keep in mind, we're about a year out from another French election, where his most popular opponent is a right wing nationalist, so don't put too much stock in Macron's words. But it
yeah.
is,
Wait for the proof.
yes, wait for actions, not words. And I will hold any leader, whether that be Orban or Putin or other people I may have favorable attitude towards, as much as I will people like Biden and Macron. If you say something, I'm going to wait and see. We did this with Trump. We did this with literally everyone. So, but I do think with the concessions Macron has been forced to make, I'm not saying he's going to become based and right wing, but he's going to have to make more concessions in order to keep the French at bay. And really, this is just what a 300-year dispute between French Enlightenment liberalism and Anglosphere Enlightenment liberalism, where I think honestly the French feel slighted that their brand of liberalism is not the dominant one, and it's the secondary one.
Yeah, I mean, their brand of liberalism, as you put it, is in their eyes the correct one. So they demand like an absolutely strong adherence to a secular state, and the recent uh, arguments and debates that you've seen on French news, with that one minister of Macron's accusing Le Pen of being too soft on Muslims. Part of that is just electioneering, but part of it is the strong adherence that France has to secularism. So, you know, would it want like more paused Muslims? Yeah, absolutely, it would. Um, but then this goes a step further, because Macron is suggesting that even something like their version of critical race theory is too much. And I think the reason for that is probably because they understand after BLM the kind of destabilization it would have on their country. France has a very sizable population of minorities. I think it's around 20%, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of them are African, and they will see parallels between themselves and America, uh, particularly around economic and historic issues. So I think he fully understands how destabilizing this could be. Now, is he serious? He could be. Does he want to use it to get elected? Absolutely. Will he follow through? I don't know. That depends on how many, protests might happen if he wins on that platform.
Yeah, I would say so, and I would say they're going for, I don't know what you'd call it, more of like a civic nationalist sort of narrative
Yeah.
where it being French is about what values you have, and these values are secular enlightenment liberalism. So I see where he's going with that. Where like we can't focus too much on the racial issue. We have to be sort of colorblind, which ironically enough has become far right rhetoric within the United States, at least. And colorblindness is racism, as I'm sure you've all heard back in like what was it, 2019, 2020, whatever. But it's it's come to that point where I would say Macron is being a, for lack of a better term, I know it's going to be an oxymoron coming from me at least, a pragmatic liberal, where he wants the system to actually be able to survive and thrive in a world of competition in a fundamentally illiberal world, whereas people within the United States, within the UK, within Canada have a more idealistic version of liberalism that they think, oh, well, we can all get together and smoke pot and sing John Lennon's Imagine. We can be whatever gender we want, and we can pay our reparations for our horrible racist crimes. Whereas Macron actually realizes liberalism needs to have a broad appeal to the population, at least to the point where they'll tolerate it, and something that can be taken seriously by liberal countries like Russia and China. And you can see quite a few liberals have really become Team Macron because of that and showed him a lot of respect and tried to prop him up as the leader of the free world. Whereas a lot of like I suppose to distinguish them, shit libs as we would call them, have pretty much, they haven't called him out, but they've ignored his existence.
Right. I think also what has to be kept in mind is the question of designations of identity based on race and ethnicity. So, France began as, now I know it was regional, but the variation in the regions in France were far more cohesive and similar to one another than they were different. And this process similarly happened, say, for instance, in Great Britain when they had their civil war, and prior to that, with the Baron Kings and so on, right? So Napoleon, in a way, unified the country, but the country was still a country before then, and it had an identity of itself that didn't have the variation in differences as it has now. So unlike America, you know, America, yes, I understand it was a British colony and it was European, but it always had an African population. And then later it brought over other Europeans who had to assimilate. And the beginning of designations is right there from the start, where even the natives called the Europeans whites. Then you have, the papers on immigration about, who can and can't come in, based on, whatever their skin tone is based on a brown paper bag. I forget where that was first written, but it was in the early part of American history after it gained its independence from Britain. So what I'm saying is France has had a long historical identity of itself as a people. And as much as it wants to talk about being a country of just values, it knows on a practical level, on a pragmatic level, as you pointed out, that that can only go so far, that there is a point where the rubber meets the road and it can be chaos. They literally cannot accept everybody. They cannot become as diverse as America. America's had centuries of being able to, and even now, it finds it extremely difficult in order to appease all these various groups that have found themselves in America, right? Um, so yeah, it's, I think, safe to say that there are some second thoughts, and we, I think what you said about the emergence of a more illiberal world coming into fruition is true when you look at the kind of influence that China is having. China is diverse, but it's not diverse in the same way. And saying, well, it has more ethnicities, yet those ethnicities on a racial level look far more like all of them look Asian to some degree, right? They're not different to the extent that, like, you have a country like, take for instance Canada. You have Africans, you have natives, and you have Indians from the subcontinent. You have all the various Europeans. You have Middle Eastern, Iranian. These groups are far more divergent from one another. You're
Well,
not
just to
talking.
put it in perspective, they want to have a distinction between the Han Chinese and the Cantonese. Now, how many? Okay, just I know outsiders maybe aren't the best judge of this, but how many people on the outside could tell the difference between a Han Chinese from northern China or a Cantonese from southern China? I couldn't. Uh, their language, again, there is variations between Cantonese and Mandarin Chinese, whatever. But again, these people can be much more easily assimilated, whether that be by voluntary means or forceful means. Like the worst problem they're having right now, which of course you haven't heard the end of, is the Uyghur population in north, yeah, in like northeastern China over there,
Mhm.
northwestern China, and again, those are the Turkic Muslim populations that they've had to really crack down on and sort of put the province under a tighter leash than they would other provinces. You've seen the same thing in Tibet, where they've really moved a lot of Han Chinese into Tibet. But they say there's 56 ethnicities in China, where most of them could be very easily assimilated into the Han Chinese if they aren't just Han Chinese with slight variations, claiming to be a different ethnicity, as you see several times. Again,
Right. It's more difficult to distinguish the 100 different Chinese ethnicities than it is able to distinguish the 3 or 4 ethnicities in America. I guess is the bottom line of what I'm saying.
yeah, and if you want to even go that far, it's harder to distinguish between that than it is between, for example, just like neighboring Europeans, a a Pole and a German, for example. You can tell the difference between a Pole and a German. Most people can. Whereas, if you want to talk about the same geographic proximity, the various different Chinese groups, it's sort of hard to tell the difference. I'm sure if you're from there and have some great sense of ethnic pride, it exists, but ultimately, it it's a meme to say China isn't more or less a homogenous Han Chinese state.
Right, and they make up a very small. The minorities make up a very small number. They may have a lot, but their numbers are very small.
Yeah, and there's no great resistance as you get with like even to the levels of Chechnya in 90s Russia to the point where they have their
Yeah.
outposts and enclaves and are holding out against uh, the national government's troops or whatever. That has, I mean, even among the Uyghurs who several have went to go fight for ISIS and Al Qaeda in Iraq and Syria and the various Middle Eastern conflicts, and again have come back into China. Not even they have started these sort of militant cells in China. Now, again, time will tell, but I don't foresee that happening in the future. But with all that being said, let's move on to our last bit of news here about Reddit Trotsky. He's back in the news again. Now, Navalny had his appeals today, and he gave very emotional, very moving arguments, including quoting philosophers like great pieces of philosophies like Harry Potter and Rick and Morty, apparently. And
Wow.
yeah, so
He is so appealing.
it is. Frankly, I want to lay down my life for this guy. I think he'd be a great leader of the Russian people. And one of the other things, just to show how much of a grifter he is, he said, well, 10 years ago, I was a militant atheist. Now I'm a religious man. A lot of my supporters will laugh at me for this, but blah, 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 blah. Funny enough, his atheist days can coincide with his so-called far-right days, which really, if I had to put it like that, he was part of like I would say his ideology was like the anti-jihad, like sort of secularist people, like fucking what's his name, like Sam Harris or whatever. Again, it was
Mhm.
like those sort of ideologies that got called the far right or whatever. But point being is, you see the man take different positions. Right now, he's a enlightened liberal. 10 years ago, he was an anti-Islam activist. Before that, he was whatever, a right-wing extremist. But point being is, he's a massive grifter who, in my opinion, deserves much more than 2.5 years in prison. And again, the appeals didn't go through. He was sort of laughing stock in the Russian media. And at the end of the day, Navalny is just a pet project by bored Western intelligence agents with nothing better to do because their agencies have, not that they were particularly competent in the first place, have become so grossly incompetent that this is their idea of overthrowing the Russian government. This is their grand opposition against Putin. This is going to overthrow the guy who's ruled Russia for, what, almost 20, 22, 21, 22 years now, and is probably going to rule throughout the majority of this decade unless he encounters some major health crisis or is forced to step down for some other reason. But point being is, we're supposed to believe that this is the guy the Russian opposition has staked their future on to get rid of Putin and his so-called horrible, Putin and his thugs, as pretty much everyone in the U.S. Congress would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pipe dream. It only makes sense if you're feasting on American media, uh, and completely bought and sold with the whole, democratic mythology. This is the guy. I mean, there's people who've known nothing about him who are, praying for the Russian people, or we almost were under a Putin regime ourselves. Like, just the most cringiest takes you've ever seen. People who are completely emotionally invested, not intellectually. They don't know anything about Navalny. And then once in a while, you'll find somebody contradict them and say, well, do you know he actually said these things and those things, as you mentioned, anti-Islamic things 10, 20 years ago? Do you know, like, he's actually, right of center in some issues than Putin? Like, it's just, the myth of democracy is so persuasive, and like I say, it needs it, right? Like, the American public needs it. That's true for the Canadian public as well. They need to see the ritual of demonstrations that that were part of their own struggles, bear themselves out in other places. For them, it's what gives their hegemonic regime um, not just respectability, but um, accountability. Like, uh, there's no question, even with all the mistakes that America has done, for instance, why America has to remain the hegemon of the world, because it would be far, far, far worse without America. Uh, so, I mean, and it's also a barometer. Really, it's the way, like, American soft power can see what its effects have been. How persuasive has their culture been on the capitals of this or that country, right? Um, that's ultimately, the real weapon that they're using.
I would say so, and
So
really,
yeah, I mean,
it's
even American deep state doesn't believe Navalny's ever going to become
no,
president.
of
But
course not.
the point is, and I wasn't suggesting that you thought that, but the point is to get people riled up and invested, reinvest in democracy, believe in it all over again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the most convoluted PR stunt I've seen in
Yeah.
probably ever. I'm gonna
Yeah.
come out and say it. And you know what? Despite Reddit Trotsky's best efforts of trying to bring freedom and democracy to the Russian people, Putler and his thugs managed to enslave Germans with their energy, with their pipelines. It's horrible. It's frankly, but yeah, even Biden, who was going to be tough on Russia, has capitulated because you know what Biden said? He said he was going to sanction, as you were saying, he was going to sanction Russians and Russian companies involved in this, but he was going to give exemptions to the Germans. Now, make what sense of that you will. And I mean, it makes sense when you look at it from a purely pragmatic standpoint that we can't afford to anger the Germans. We can't afford to sow any more division that has already been sown into NATO, especially with such a vital country like Germany, the economic engine of Europe currently. And even, look, I know we've trashed on the German military for their readiness and their capabilities, but theoretically, Germany has a very powerful military, and if it were to ever be a conventional war in Europe, which I don't see anytime soon, if at all, Germany would be one of the primary forces in being able to fight back a hypothetical one in a million sort of Russian invasion. So the Germans have to be kept happy. They have to be kept at bay. They're a very vital piece within this system. And already, I mean, Trump tried to sell them American energy. Biden, again, has sort of pulled the plug on American energy. And really, it's we can freeze the German people out in the middle of winter. I don't know how bad Europe has been hit by the polar vortex. I saw that there were snowstorms in places like Spain and Greece, so I imagine they're probably not faring too well themselves. But point being is, he can either pull the plug and raise, in a roundabout way, raise German energy prices during a particularly harsh winter, or he can concede ground and let Russia get their tentacles in there and influence German politics and install I don't know, install another Putler puppet in a Western European country, whatever narrative they're going with now. But point being is, despite what they want, it is untenable to punish the German side of the Nord Stream 2 project or any of the other quote unquote American European partners of the Nord Stream 2 project. And it has to be focused on Russia, which, again, those efforts have been to little to no avail thus far.
Right, and Reagan similarly railed against Germany for Nord Stream 1. Um, so and that didn't do anything. It wasn't shut down. And so now we're at Nord Stream 2. I think this back and forth that's going on. I think it also uh, reveals something that is kind of subconscious. Like, for instance, America can bear hard power when it wants to, when it sees fit. It can go to an extreme that we've never seen any other nation do in the last 30, 40 years. However, for political purposes, it relies on soft power far more, and it has had to, considering Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, when they describe Russian power, they describe it as a hard power. It's implied that it's a hard power. So you have to believe that Russia invaded Crimea, like there weren't Russians there already, or there weren't Russian forces for years there already, or Russian ships. So, by that metric, the way Russia regained Crimea, through a vote and outnumbered militarily, was hardly an example of hard power. It was an example of soft power. And I think that's where the panic is, that if Germany buys too much gas from Russia, Germany is going to be pulled away magically by the Russians. Now, that is ridiculous. However, I think maybe like there is a truth to it. And what I mean is, historically, what the Anglosphere has worried about the most, particularly Britain, but now, in this century, we can't talk about Britain and America separately. You have to kind of treat them almost as one entity. And what the fear in the 19th century and in the 20th century was cooperation between Russia and Germany. That would basically nullify, British power in Europe. So I do
Yeah, and on
think,
both sides, you saw the efforts by the British and the French in particular to keep Russia and Germany, and by a lesser extent the Austrians, at odds with each other. Whereas you had even
yes.
somebody like Bismarck who wanted to solidify a Russian German alliance in order to again, sort of create a continental power that could offset British and French naval power.
Right, right. And I would posit that they are definitely afraid of that. That this combination, I mean, I think potentially this combination would even scare China.
Absolutely, it would.
So I think that's what they're really afraid of. But of course, they can't reveal that. They have to use Crimea. They have to have um, Estonians and Poles wringing their hands that a chunk of their country is going to be taken away any moment by the Russians. So again, they have to fall back on a narrative of Russia, the hard power tyrant, when in fact what they're really afraid of is this cooperation that would benefit more, both those countries, and they would be unequivocally the powers of Europe, and in many ways the deserved powers of Europe, given their strength, their contributions, their vitality, the way they've come back even after defeat. That has always scared the Anglosphere Britain, say, more so because they're there. Um, yeah, so I would say there's a hint of truth there that they can't really explore openly.
Yeah, and just to put more context, that this is something we've been meaning to do a show about for a while. I mean, you saw in the lead up to World War One, the late 19th, early 20th century, but with the British and French reconciliation with Russia, that they wanted Russia and Germany at odds, if not at war with each other,
Yes.
because of that. And again, like I said, I want to do an entire episode dedicated to going back like from the Crimean War onwards, but we'll get that eventually. And a massive
Yeah.
anecdote I have to back this up is during the Bundestag protest, I believe that was in last October, when you had a lot of people protesting outside of that, and they had like the QAnon flags. They had
Yeah.
three flags in particular. They had the QAnon flags, they had the flags of Imperial Germany, and the Russian flags outside of the Bundestag. Now, of course, unlike the American protests, they never breached because the authorities didn't let them in. Believe it or not, it's kind of funny how it turns out that way. But just it seems like, especially among the German right, like with groups like the ADF or AFD, there is a desire for cooperation with Russia. And I'm not saying that Germany hasn't been encapsulated by liberalism by the rest of the West, but they are, I would say, out of all the Western European populations, one of the more or less conservative groups.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
But I suppose, with all that being said, with the budding Russian German Empire, as you put it the other day, we've covered all the news for the week.
Indeed, we have.
Well, that was a rather interesting episode, getting back on track. We'll see where the rest of February and moving on forward through March and through the spring, where that takes us. And just keep your eye out for new episodes. Things are chugging along as usual. But I suppose we'll see you guys next week, and goodbye.
Take care, guys.